مشاهدينا الكرام، أرحب بكم في حلقة جديدة من حلقات سؤال جريء. ضيفي لهذه الحلقة هو الدكتور ألفين شميت، وهو كاتب وأستاذ سابق في جامعة إلينوي في أمريكا، وهو أيضا أستاذ محاضر وباحث في علم الاجتماع. ومن بين أهم كتبه كيف غيرت المسيحية العالم. أنصح كل من يريد أن يعرف المزيد عن هذا الموضوع أن يقتني هذا الكتاب، لأنه في الحقيقة وثيقة مهمة جدا في تاريخ المسيحية، بل ويدرس كمرجع أكاديمي في بعض الجامعات الأمريكية. أجريت هذا اللقاء المسجل منذ سنوات، لكن لم تتح لي الفرصة لعرضه إلا الآن. اللقاء مقسم لقسمين. القسم الأول متعلق بكيف غيرت المسيحية العالم، وفيه نتطرق لأسئلة كثيرة متعلقة بهذا الموضوع. والقسم الثاني حول الإسلام في الغرب، وسأقوم بشرح محتوياته حين أصل إليه. في القسم الأول سنعالج أسئلة كثيرة ومغالطات عديدة عن المسيحية تروج لها جهات كثيرة في العالم العربي والإسلامي دون أن يكون لها سند أو مرجع علمي. اليوم سنطرح الأسئلة الجريئة حولها بحثا عن الإجابات. هل المسيحية ضد العلم وضد استخدام العقل كما يدعي البعض؟ هل المسيحية اضطهدت العلماء وأحرقتهم؟ هل المسيحية رفضت فكرة أن الأرض تدور حول الشمس؟ هل يوجد علماء مسيحيون؟ أم أن المسيحية لم يعتنقها العلماء لأنها تتعارض مع العقل؟ بالمقابل سنوضح النواحي الإيجابية التي يتجاهلها من يريدون الإساءة لسمعة المسيحية. هل قدمت المسيحية شيئا يذكر للعالم؟ ماذا قدمت المسيحية في العلاقات، خصوصا في الزواج والنظرة للجنس؟ ماذا قدمت المسيحية في العلوم؟ ماذا قدمت المسيحية في الأدب؟ ماذا قدمت في القوانين وحقوق الإنسان؟ ماذا قدمت بالنسبة لحقوق المرأة؟ وماذا قدمت في الموسيقى والفنون؟ وما الذي قدمته المسيحية في الاقتصاد؟ أسئلة كثيرة. كل هذه الأسئلة سأطرحها على الدكتور شميت، الذي سيأخذنا في رحلة فريدة نتعلم فيها ما تم التعتيم عنه في بلداننا، لأنهم حاولوا أن يصوروا لنا المسيحية في أبشع الصور وشوهوا لنا الصورة الحقيقية. رافقوني في هذا الجزء الأول، ثم بعد انتهائه سأقوم بتقديم الجزء الثاني من الحلقة. Dr. Schmidt, glad to have you here. I'll ask you, please, if you can introduce yourself to our viewers in the Arab world.
Well, thank you first for having me. Brief introduction in terms of who I am. I was born and raised in Western Canada. I even spent some time with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Then I came to the United States to go back to school, to college. And also I have a theological degree. I'm a Lutheran pastor. And I've taught in college, different colleges, 4 of them, for 36 years. I'm married to my first wife, as I often say. I never had another one. And 2 growing sons, and the good Lord has blessed us with many, many things far than beyond what we deserve. And I enjoyed being a college professor for all those years. All told, I think I had over 7,000 students in my 36 years. So then I've embarked on writing. I've published 8 different books, and one of them is How Christianity Changed the World, and another one, The Great Divide, The Failure of Islam and the Triumph of the West. These are 2 more recent books that I published.
I read some of your book, How Christianity Changed the World, and I'm really amazed of the stuff you brought up. And I have some questions here about this book. First of all, how has Christianity influenced its societies on morality, especially views on sex and marriage?
Yeah, immensely so. And most of us do not really realize how much Christianity has influenced even our secular culture today. There are still many, many influences of Christianity that were not present before the time of Christ, like in the Greeks and the Romans. For example, sexual life was very immoral. Marriage was basically a ridiculous institution, mocked and made fun of. And in addition to that, the Romans as well as the Greeks practiced homosexuality very widely. And what is often not known, the homosexuality that was practiced in there was really pedophilia. Pederasty, it's often called. It was commonly an adult man with a puberty-aged boy. That's what was commonly the homosexual practices. We don't know that today, but that's what was the case. And we see that was condemned by St. Paul in the first chapter of Romans. And we see also, for example, that there was other sexual immorality. Adultery was very widespread. In fact, we have now artistic archaeological evidence that shows, for instance, that pornographic pictures were portrayed on household items like lamp vases and on dishes and other kinds of ceramic objects, leaving nothing to the imagination. This is how the Romans saw and viewed sex. And it wasn't much different in the Greek society. The Romans in many ways imitated what the Greeks did. And you also we found evidence now that bestiality, sex between a human being and an animal, was practiced. And so Christianity opposed all that. It opposed homosexuality. It opposed adultery. In fact, we see the Romans, the pagan authors often said, the Christians have a common table, but they don't have a common bed. In other words, marriage was honored. And the Christians also saw marriage as something that was ordained by God, and marriage made a husband and a wife one flesh. This was totally foreign to the Greeks and the Romans. And being the fact that they were of one flesh meant that they were supposed to be faithful and true to one another. And so the difference in terms of the sexual morality was revolutionary. It was revolutionized in more ways than one. And Jesus even said, for example, whosoever looks on a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery. There you have another example. And it's also interesting to know that at the time of Christ, even among the Hebrews, it was very common for example, a woman to be mistreated sexually, and also very common to have a husband to have more than one wife. But Jesus says, the two shall be one flesh, not three or four. And for this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother. In other words, the whole idea of sexual morality, elevated extremely high, was also very much tied together with the great respect that Christianity had for marriage.
Yeah, now when we look at the West, we see immorality like increasing. And in our Muslim countries, they taught us that since the West is Christian and immorality is increasing, it's somehow linked to Christianity. It's the teachings of Christianity that led the West to this situation.
Yeah, that's a very common thing, you know, and it's really a fallacy to, particularly today, to equate Christianity with the West. While Christianity has had a lot of influence on the West has also retained and even introduced new pagan, non-biblical practices. For example, the wide acceptance of homosexuality, or you know, marriage of the same sex, if you will, is very foreign, very recent, and that is not to be equated with Christianity. And I know that many Muslims see Christianity equal sign the West, which is really not true. The West really never was, even though it was greatly influenced by Christianity, ever a Christian world, so to speak. There were always differences. For example, that the West did not accept what Christianity introduced, but today that's more pronounced than ever. So to say that Christianity and the West are the same is a fallacy that we need to correct and very quickly point out that Christianity from the beginning opposed many of the things that today are advocated. For, you know, for example, it was back in about 374 where the Roman emperor, now a Christian, outlawed homosexuality. See, Christianity for the first 300 years was severely persecuted. It didn't have much voice, but nevertheless, they did make such an impact that finally by 313, even Constantine wrote an edict and legalized Christianity. And now thereafter, more and more things happened. He died in 337, and then after that, the Christian emperors, many of them, established, for example, laws that supported what the Christians introduced. But now, a lot of that is being, well, evaporating.
But when we look at some churches, for example, that endorse homosexual marriages, that's seen in our Muslim countries as, see, the church is supporting that. So.
Well, yeah, definitely you have some liberal theological Christian groups, I'm not sure they're even Christian, that are doing what you said. We have a Lutheran body called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America that has just only less than a month ago approved homosexuals to be ordained clergy. Well, this again is a segment among Lutherans. It's not all of them. And so you have segments in other parts of the Christian group that have approved homosexual marriages and a homosexual lifestyle contrary to the Bible. And why they're doing it is because they really no longer take the Word of God seriously.
So for you, these churches, they are not really the church that we see in the Gospels?
No,
or
they're
the
very
Bible?
much a departure. In fact, you might say they're a fallen away group. Mm-hmm. They are turning their back on what the Christians with Jesus and the apostles taught.
And how can you tell us about Christianity being different than other religions concerning the status of women?
Yes, well, there is another, there are many historians that have written for a long time, and we usually don't hear their statements, that Christ changed the life of women. If there's anything that he did at all, some would say, this is certainly one. And let me illustrate how he changed the life of women. All right. That we grow up with women having a lot of freedom today, in the West in particular. And we take this for granted. We think it was always that way. No, it was not. Let's go back to the ancient Greeks. The woman could not leave her house without being accompanied by her husband or some male escort that he would appoint. She couldn't sit with his guests. She was confined to a gymnasium, as it was called.
And why is that?
Because a woman was not supposed to be having contact with men. Why? Many reasons. One was that she might be tempting other men sexually. And it said an awful lot of things about the weakness of men, which they didn't realize. It was not the fault of the woman. That's why also a lot of the women, even in Muslim societies, are veiled today. Why are they veiled? Because they're going to tempt the man. So the evil lies not in the woman. It lies in the man who can't control or doesn't want to control his sexual impulses, his lust, as Jesus would say. They look on a woman with lust in their heart. Well, Christianity, also with the Romans, very much, woman had hardly any rights. She had no property rights. She, for example, couldn't testify in court. And the literature is full. For example, the Greek poets, whether it's Aristophanes, Euripides, Sophocles, they all talk about the woman's inferior status and role, that she wasn't allowed to speak in public. You have in the Homer's Odyssey, for example, Telemachus telling his mother, speech is for men, not for women. In other words, you keep quiet, speaking this to his mother. Now, we grow up and we hear women talk with men, circulate with men, right. But that's another example of Christianity that was not there at the time of Christ. For example, take the Gospel of John, the 4th chapter. Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman at the well. And what does she say when he talks to her? Why are you talking to a Samaritan woman? He wasn't just saying she wasn't just saying Samaritan. She was saying a woman. A man in the Hebrew society in Jesus' day did not talk to his woman, not even to his own wife, in public. Jesus spoke to a woman that was not even his wife. And this woman was taken aback. Why are you talking to me as a woman? We tend to miss that phrase in the Gospel of John in the 4th chapter. We tend to hear only the word Samaritan, which were an ostracized group.
That's
but
right.
Woman is very, very important. Jesus also, we read in the Gospel of Mark, we read in the Gospel of Luke, had women follow him. Now, that was, again, a totally unconventional behavior. A woman was not supposed to follow a man unless she was of ill repute. Jesus did not scold these women. He welcomed them. When we have the example of Jesus meeting with Mary and Martha in Bethany in their own home.
Yes.
And what happened there? Well, Martha was trying to prepare a meal. She was trying to be good and nice to him, whereas Mary, her sister, sat at the feet of Jesus and was listening to him. Finally, Martha begins to complain. In other words, Mary, why aren't you helping me?
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, of course.
That's right.
And then Jesus said to her, Mary has chosen the good part. She was, in other words, listening Jesus' teaching.
Learning.
So again, he showed women were, unlike the Hebrew society, in the Hebrew society, the rabbinic era, which existed from about 300 BC right through time of Jesus, the oral law, as it's often called, made up by the rabbis, a woman was not supposed to speak in public. She had to walk behind a man in public. In fact, there are phrases from rabbinic literature that says it's better to burn the law, the Torah, than to commit into a woman. And silence of the woman was seen as golden. Jesus did not tell the women to be silent. When the Samaritan woman spoke to him, he didn't say, now you got to be silent, as the rabbis would have. In fact, it's interesting, you go back to the Gospel of John, the 4th chapter. When the disciples come upon the scene, they say, what are you doing talking to a woman?
That's right.
They were flustered. They said, so Jesus broke the barrier, so to speak, about how women are supposed to be seen and related. And then we see in the early Christian church how women were honored. For example, Paul in Romans chapter 16 talks about Phoebe or Phoebe, whichever pronunciation one wants to use. She was a deaconess. By the way, not deaconess as the translations say. The Greek feminine word for deaconess, in other words, deaconess, didn't come into being about the 380. So Paul uses a male term through Phoebe. She was a deaconess. He also talks, and he said that she was very helpful to him. Then you have Priscilla and Aquila, who taught, straighten out Apollos' understanding of Christianity. And St. Chrysostom, a church father who died in 407, said she played the major role in changing Apollos' understanding of what Christianity was all about. And so we go on and on. We see, for example, also in Galatians 3:28, where Paul is talking to the Galatians saying there is neither Greek nor Jew nor slave nor male nor female, but we're all one in Christ Jesus. Again, women and men were equalized. They were seen as equal. This was revolutionary. This was just totally foreign to the Hebrews, to the Greeks, and to the Romans. We don't seem to know that, but that's really what was the case.
But some Muslims take some verses, for example, when Paul talked about women in Corinthians, saying that women should not speak in the church, and taking other verses about women sinned first, and they see Christianity is treating women as unequal to men.
Yeah, they pick on that particular passage, and that passage, for example, has also very often been not very correctly or properly understood by a lot of Christian theologians.
Right.
If you look at the passage closely, Paul, according to says, not to speak to a woman, and then he says, for so or thus says the law. Now we have to ask, what law? There was no law in the Old Testament. There was no law, for example, among the Christians that a woman couldn't speak. But there was a law in the rabbinic oral law where a woman couldn't speak. So Paul was saying, basically what he was doing, he was taking a quotation from the oral law of a woman not speaking the law, which theologians have largely missed. For example, to say that Paul didn't let women speak in the church is simply, you really have a hard time making an argument for that, because when he talks about, for example, Phoebe, for example, that she, and also said that she was a prostatis, which is the Greek term for a leading member of the church at Sennacherib. See, she couldn't be a leader if she was silent.
Right.
Not very likely.
Right.
And then we also know that Paul speaks about Judea and Syntyche, who were co-workers, fellow workers, he says, with me in promoting the gospel of Jesus Christ. Again, they obviously had to be speaking to be promoters and supporters of him. So there are a lot of passages that we overlook. They zero in on one, which I said has not been properly understood, because as I said, Paul was really quoting. You see, they didn't do it that day and age. They didn't use footnotes as we do. So when Paul says, so thus says the law, he was referring to the oral law. And it's interesting, in the next verse he says, what did the Holy Ghost speak only to you? In other words, he was not accepting the idea that women should be silent in the church. As the Corinthians, there were a lot of people in the Corinthian church that were influenced by society at large. You know, Christianity didn't all at once convince everybody and inform everybody properly. So some in the Corinthians, there were other problems in the Corinthian church that Paul really here, in a sense, had to correct.
Another topic, can you tell us, for example, how Christianity had any influence on development of hospitals and medicine in general?
Yes, an immense. One of the surprising things, I might say, when I began to write this book, probably 90% of what I say in the book, I did not know until I did the research. I, too, was influenced by my culture, which never really told me about the massive influence of Christianity. And so, for example, when you're asking about the hospitals
and medicine.
One of the surprising things, and I've always been a student, Greek was one of my favorite languages I studied when I studied for the ministry. And I still love Greek to this day, the classical Greek, the Koine Greek. And one of the things that I discovered as I did the research, that these brilliant Greeks had no hospitals, nor did the Romans. The Christians were the first to introduce hospital. It was a Christian innovation. Now, this is never mentioned in history books. It should be, and I document how this is true. We have the first real example at the Council of Nicaea, which was in 325, from which we get the Nicene Creed, where among the many stipulations and resolutions, if you will, that were passed at that council, it says, for example, that in every diocese or where there was a bishop, there was supposed to be a hospice to take care of sick and also some of the traveling people. That was the beginning. Then in 369, the first formal hospital was built in the east. Then, not much longer, they were built in the west. And why did the Christians build hospitals? Well, they took seriously Jesus' passage, who, for example, said, whatever you have done to the least of these, you have done it unto me.
Right.
The Christians, even before they built hospitals, for example, when there were battles going on between the Roman groups and the like, and the Christians, who were, many of them were soldiers, would very often go and feed and nurse those who were poor. There is an author by the name of Pomokius who became a Christian when he saw how the Christians, for example, related to the sick and the needy. And it's also interesting to know in the 5th century BC, around 470, at the Peloponnese War, Thucydides, a Greek writer, talks about when plagues hit, their own relatives would desert them. The Christians came later on and picked up the people who were plagued, and the Romans would say, these guys are crazy. Don't they know they're going to die? But the love of Christ motivated to them to do this. And so they built hospitals, and I might add a little more. Even to this day, hospitals still reflect, in many cases, their Christian origin. Many of them are called according to religious denomination: Methodist Hospital, Baptist Hospital, Lutheran Hospital, Catholic Hospital, or St. Joe's Hospital, or St. Luke's. You see, but we don't know the origin. It goes all the way back to the early Christian church. And so they really introduced a phenomenal new thing. Now, if the Christians had never come on the scene, would we have had hospitals? I don't know. And when? I don't know either.
And even the Roman Empire didn't have hospitals at that time?
No, they did not have the best that one can find. They had something that comes close to taking care of wounded soldiers in war, but there was never an institutionalized hospital.
Right.
It just was not in existence. And this is a very puzzling thing. Why not? Well, the Romans weren't influenced to have love for their human beings, whereas the Christians did. They saw the human being as having been created in the image of God, and therefore he was important, whether sick or healthy.
Right. Well, this will lead us to another topic. What about education? Can we see the influence of Christianity on education?
Yes, again, immensely so. Christianity was, of course, premised on the basis that it had to be taught. Jesus, at the end of Matthew, in 28th chapter, told the disciples, for example, to baptize all nations and to teach them. Well, so we see very early in the church that, for example, not only the apostles, they taught, but by the year 150, we see already catechetical schools were introduced in Alexandria, in Caesarea, for example, basically in Palestine, where people were taught, in some cases, not just about the scripture, but they were also taught elements of the liberal arts, reading and writing and arithmetic. And interestingly, women were included with men. In other words, co-education, as we know, but was something started by the Christians.
No
the Greeks and the Romans didn't. There was no co-education. In fact, most of the time, there was no education for women at all. Women had to learn from their mother at home. And even for boys, education was mostly for the upper class people, not for the average working class or slave children.
Right. And what about science? In our Muslim countries, they always told us that Christianity is against science and scientists in general. And they give some examples like Copernicus, Bruno, and Galileo, and others. So how can you reply to that claim?
Well, yes. Christianity, again, as I point out in the book, and I document, there was a very famous philosopher of science by the name of Alfred North Whitehead, not a Christian, says the beginnings of science were the product of medieval Christian theology. In other words, Christianity, and he goes on to say, underlying science is the pursuit of understanding the universe from a rational mind. Christianity, he says, posited God as a rational being, and that God created human beings in his image, also given to rationality. And the Christians, for example, again, I'm talking about about Whitehead, saw, for example, that the world should be understood rationally, which led to scientific laws. And it's interesting, for instance, that you find by the 11th, 12th century, for example, you have the first real chancellor of Oxford University, a person by the name of Robert Grosseteste, who argued for Christians to base their knowledge on inductive empirical examination. This was very contrary to the Greeks. The Greeks believed that you could arrive at knowledge simply by deductive thinking. In other words, I used to tell my students something, and they thought it was funny, but it was true. The Greeks would argue as to how many teeth there were in a horse's mouth. They didn't go and count. That would be the inductive empirical method. And so all the way into even roughly 1 year 1000, the Christian theologians were still largely influenced by this Aristotelian Greek thinking. Until, for example, Grosseteste, and then his student by the name of Roger Bacon, who even wrote a number of books arguing that knowledge had to be derived on the basis of inductive empirical observation, which is the foundation of science. And then we see other scientists after that. Francis Bacon, about 200 years in the 1600s, arguing again for the same thing. Then you move in a little bit later into the late 1500s, early 1600s, with Johann Kepler, who gave science the first scientific laws, namely that the Earth rotates in an elliptical fashion. Now, you see, very interesting. He tried to figure out, because Aristotle argued that a circle was the most perfect thing. So everybody, including Kepler, believed that planets would have to circulate or rotate in a perfect circle. It doesn't come out mathematically. Finally, he stumbled on the idea that it's probably elliptic, and sure enough, there's this first scientific law that planets evolve elliptically. We read this in textbooks today, but we never hear that it was Kepler, who was a devout Christian, and then he had another law. He said that the Earth moves faster when it's closer to the sun and slower when it's farther from the sun. That's his second law. And the third law was called the law of harmony, which is a little more complicated. So the first three scientific laws, based on empirical observation through telescope and the like, were espoused by Kepler. And so we could go on. I list many others, like Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry. Boyle's laws we studied even in high school, was a devout Christian who, for example, gave money for missions in his final days and even while he was alive.
In our Muslim countries, they always told us that Christianity is against science and scientists, and they give an example, Copernicus, Bruno, Galileo, others, and they say the church executed some, burned some, and it's just against science, contradicts science.
Really, there's a little bit of truth to that, but most of it is false. Let me focus primarily on Copernicus. Copernicus was a canon in the Roman Catholic Church. And for example, he worked on this particular book, which we usually translate as the Revolution of the Heavenly Bodies. What's interesting is, for example, that he was afraid when the book was ready to be published to publish it. Why? Not because of the church, but because of fellow scientists who still believed in the Ptolemaic system, namely that the earth revolves around the earth, the sun revolves around the earth rather than the earth around the sun.
Right.
In other words, he was putting forth the heliocentric system, the sun being the center of the universe, rather than the geocentric system, which was the earth was the center of the world. But his book was published because of three prominent Christians. One was the Duke of the Duke of Prussia, a Lutheran Christian who underwrote it financially. Then there was a guy by the name of Radicus, a mathematics professor from the University of Wittenberg, where Luther was, who went for 2 years to help him complete the work. He supervised the publishing. And then a Lutheran pastor in Nuremberg, Germany, also was involved in getting the book published. It's, in other words, the church persecuted. It was only the Roman Catholic Church. It was not the Protestant world that persecuted Copernicus, if you will. And we often read it was because the church, no, he was afraid of fellow scientists, because this idea was not accepted by even Galileo. A long time later, still had trouble with a lot of the Copernican hypotheses. So it was not the church that was only involved here, but as I have to say, it was only a segment of the church. And for example, you have later then in the mid-1645, for example, you had the Royal Society of London, the most prestigious scientific organization, was founded by largely Calvinist theologians in England. And so they say that the church was persecuting science is hardly even a half-truth.
Well, what I heard like so many times from Muslims is the Bible teaches that the earth is flat, and whoever says it's round was executed or persecuted or threatened by the church.
Well, that also is not true. For example, you have even in the Old Testament where I believe it's in Job, where it says God hangs the world on nothing. In other words, which would support the theory of gravity as we have it today. And when it spoke about four corners of the earth, this was a metaphor. We still speak of four corners of the earth today, but we don't mean that the earth is necessarily four quarters like a square, not at all. And so again, people pick out tidbit here and a tidbit there. And as I often say, like Paul Harvey would say, they don't tell us the rest of the story.
Right. Do you have a list of scientists who influenced the world by their inventions, for example?
Oh, yes. For example, in the book here, I mentioned a whole series of scientists, for example, that not only produced inventions, but let me just, off the top of my head, mention, for instance, for example, I mentioned Kepler a little while ago, his particular contributions to science. And we had Boyle, the chemist, and we had, for example, Faraday in electricity, and we had Ohms in electricity, for instance. We had also, for example, Pare, P-A-R-E, who basically developed the idea of surgery, for example, and to stop blood from flowing among soldiers. And so scientists after scientists who were all Christian. What's interesting to note, before the year 1800, one cannot find a scientist who wasn't a devout Christian. And everyone used his Christian understanding to try and integrate his understanding of Christianity into his scientific explanations, philosophy, and theories. Right. It happened after 1800 that the world began to move toward what is often called philosophical materialism, where, for example, God was excluded from the whole scientific venture of thought. And that's what we are basically operating today. But it was not so let me give you another example. We all know about Louis Pasteur. From we get the word of pasteurize, for example,
right,
who discovered bacteria. When he died, he had his wife's hand in one hand and a cross in the other hand. Now, talk about a devout Christian, right to the last moment. And so these people, none of them, and I list a whole series of them, ever saw Christianity in conflict with science. In fact, going back to the quotation that I mentioned before from Northhead, that Christianity was understood that God was rational. We as human beings, also rational, can understand and discover the laws in nature by rational process. And we do this by inductive empirical examination.
Well, today we see science as something that contradicts religion, and we put it that way. And do you see that Christianity contradicts science in any way?
Well, yeah, again, that is a cliche that is really unsupportable. Because if you look, for example, there are at least as many scientists today that are devout Christians as there are those who are not. So, for example, there is not agreement on people who say, for example, that science contradicts Christianity or Christianity contradicts science. No, not at all. And truth is one. And when it has been said that science contradicts Christianity, often the scientific findings at that time were not really up to par. And later on were modified. For example, when we go back before the days of Kepler, the world of science saw the circle as that perfect, and that for example, that the sun was revolving around the earth. They didn't have it straight until later on we made the modifications, but Christians largely have to be credited for science. And I give the citations in the book from people who weren't even Christians who say this.
Right. What about economics and labor? What Christianity did or add to economics and labor?
A tremendous amount in the realm of labor and economics that we, again, take for granted. It is in labor, for example, among the Greeks, was a demeaning activity. It was something only, particularly manual labor, only for slaves. A person who was of the upper class, philosopher kings, as Plato would call them, were not to be involved in any kind of manual labor. And we can find numerous quotations, not just from Plato, but also from Seneca, the Roman, who ridiculed manual labor. It was only for slaves, not for non-slaves. Christianity came along and changed that. It changed it in more ways than one. Christ was a son of a carpenter, who undoubtedly did carpentry work for a number of years before he became engaged formally in the ministry.
Right.
Paul was a tent maker. And the Christians never saw labor as something foreign to God. In fact, you find even in the Old Testament, where it talks about a labor is worthy of his hire. And so Christians saw labor. And by the way, even before Christ, the Hebrews would often teach their boys to not just academics, but also teach them a trade that they could make their living by.
But I heard some Muslims like quoting from Genesis and saying that labor is seen in Christianity as a curse happen after sin because men have to work and to get...
Well, sure. It says in Genesis, by the sweat of your brow after the fall of man you shall earn your...
Right.
So in other words, not labor. God wants people to work. That's very, very clear, for example. Even before the fall, Adam was not sitting there and smelling roses. As best as we can tell, Adam and Eve were to be engaged in keeping up the garden, if you will, until they fell in. And now, for example, there's a difference between work and toiling at it. Labor was supposed to be done to the glory of God, by the way, which Christians try to revive later on.
Right.
Whereas, for example, after the fall, labor became a self-serving thing for the most part, except for what Christians were trying to do. Even to this day, most of us go to work not for the glory of God, but until relatively recently in history, in Western society, people went to work to glorify God. To support the family was a secondary thing. Luther, for example, talks about God being hidden in work. He uses the Latin phrase de larvae, meaning God is hidden in a mask, in work. We do the work and we don't know that God is involved, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian. In order to keep God's world functioning, people have to work and do various activities. But it is God's design that people do this. But the average person, including most Christians, never see God in their work. But Luther says he's nevertheless there. He's there with a mask. We don't see him. You see, again, the great emphasis of labor being, or work, if you will, something that's meritorious and to be done to God's glory, not for our own selfish interests.
And now I'll move to another subject about justice and liberty, and how Christianity changed or contributed to justice and liberty in the world. Yeah,
Christianity, again, we live in a society that has had more freedom than the world has ever experienced at any time in history. And a lot of it, most of it, has Christian influence or reflects Christian influences. For instance, in liberty and justice, we talk about injustice, for example, that like even the Old Testament, you couldn't convict a person of a crime unless you had 2 eyewitnesses. Now that is moving toward justice. You couldn't just do it summarily, as a lot of the Roman emperors and others summarily kill a person without any witnesses just because you didn't like him, he was executed. You also have further on, then, for example, in the early church.
But sorry to interrupt you here,
sure.
But even before the Bible, when we read about Neo-Babylonian people, Hammurabi, for example, laws, they existed before the Bible. Did Christianity or the Bible bring anything new to the world?
Well,
about justice and
yes. How much of Hammurabi basically existed before the Bible, or before, if you will, the written Bible, but for example, the oral transmission of God's word, for example, is a debatable thing. But Christianity, or the Jews in the Old Testament, if you will, or the Hebrews, for example, we don't find anything, for example, in the Code of Hammurabi that talks about justice as we see it later on in the Hebrew side, and particularly in Christianity. Where, for example, see, another thing that's very obvious, the individual was given a tremendous amount of value in the whole Christian ethic, if you will. You don't find that preceding Christianity. You do a little bit in the Old Testament, but Christianity really brought that to the fore. We have to remember that the New Testament is a fulfillment of the Old. And so many things are said in the New Testament that really were perhaps only kind of a shadow or hinted at, which Christianity then spelled out. But when you go to, for example, of justice, in the year 390, you had now a Christian emperor of the Roman Empire by the name of Theodosius I. There was a riot that happened that year in Thessalonica. He overreacted and he killed 7,000 people. He was called on the carpet, if I may use that common expression, by the Bishop of Milan, who was St. Ambrose. Why him? Well, Theodosius' palace was in Milan, Italy.
Okay.
He said, I'm going to what you did was evil, killing those 7,000 people. I'm going to excommunicate you unless you repent. He didn't repent. After a while, he did. In fact, he dressed in sackcloth and ashes. I have a picture in the book here, in front of the whole congregation, and repented of his sin. What was the message? Ambrose was saying, even though you're emperor, you're not above the law.
All right.
You see, here we get that principle from no man is above the law that we hear a lot, for example, in our society. Then you have about 800 years later, the Magna Carta was signed in England in 1215. The Magna Carta, if you look at its preamble, was written in Christian language by Archbishop of Canterbury. And these people sat down before King John and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which literally means the big chart in Latin, that they were not to be deprived of basic human liberties and rights.
Right.
So Our laws today are largely, in many ways, derived from the Magna Carta, including our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But where did it come from? From Christian origins, influenced by Christian philosophy that no man's above the law, including the king, and now later, not even you, King John. You're not above the law. Right. And so, again, a Christian influence that was largely overlooked, and to our detriment in many ways, even to our detriment as Christians. We don't understand the many things that Christianity produced. Now, I might mention one other thing. Christ did not come into this world to change the world politically, but the Christians changed it as a byproduct of their gospel message. You see what I mean? It was a byproduct. It was not the focus. Christ was not a revolution in the sense of saying, I'm going to change the world. But it
happened in the process.
But it happened in the process as a byproduct.
Right. What about freedom of speech? Like, we're talking about liberties. What about freedom of speech?
Well, yeah, freedom of speech, for instance, yes. You find, for example, even in the New Testament, where people are questioning what Jesus was saying. Jesus never, for example, ever countered and said they had no right to speak. We know also, for example, with the apostles who spoke, they were often criticized. They were not only criticized, they were finally martyred. Freedom of speech was a given because it's part of the human being's right to be able to express himself, whether it's in family relationships or outside. And there are many secular philosophers that would say, before Christianity, there was no real freedom of speech. You were living in fear and intimidation, that if you said something against the emperor or whoever was in control, you would be imprisoned and maybe even executed. Christianity, with the influence, then, for example, with Constantine in the early 400s, early 300s, early 4th century, I should say, a lot of this changed because they began to see that there was a spirit of freedom among Christians.
Right.
God wants everybody to be a Christian, but God never coerced anybody into the kingdom of God. It was a matter of choice. And God gave the human being a free will that could express himself or herself in speech, if you will.
What about slavery? Did Christianity do anything in regards of slavery?
Yes, there have been many books written showing that Christianity was the problem for slavery. Again, those books are really historically inaccurate and false.
Why?
We find, for example, already in the New Testament, the little short book of Philemon, that Paul wrote to him, for example, whose slave Onesimus ran away.
Right.
They captured him. They brought him back. And then what does Paul say? Treat him now as a brother, no longer as a slave. Paul laid the first foundation for the abolition of slavery. Now, many Christians didn't always take Paul's words seriously, or they didn't even know about it. So we had some Christians, even in the early church, that kept slaves. But there were also many, for example, I point out, that released slaves by the hundreds and the thousands in the year 300, 400. The Christians took slaves together with them in Christian worship. They admitted them to the Lord's altar. They admitted them, they baptized them. They made no distinction between a Christian and a slave. And by the year 1200, Europe was essentially free of slavery. 200 years later, it came back with the British Empire importing slaves from Africa, brought them to the New World and so on, as we well know. But it wasn't there for at least a couple hundred years. And then we also see, for example, that in the Christian church, that slavery, as I said with the Galatian passage, there's neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free. Christianity was opposed to slavery. And then we see it in this world, for example, with the influence of Uncle Tom's Cabin that was written, for example, by a Christian woman.
But some Muslims point out Paul's writings when he's asking slaves to obey their masters, and they say, here you go, Christianity is tolerating slavery, or actually is not at least prohibiting slavery.
Well, two comments. First of all, the word slave in Greek is the word doulos, which can also mean servant. And so when Paul says obey, he was talking about servant. Now, we have servants to this day. If you're working for somebody, you are in essence a servant. So to argue that that Christians support of slavery is a very, very, very weak argument. It also overlooks, for example, who are the Muslims to criticize Christians about slavery? When, for example, there's slavery in Sudan, a Muslim country, in Mauritania. A few years ago, I had a friend who went to Nigeria for a week with Rotary. He said, we were served by slaves in Nigeria. Right. And even countries like Saudi Arabia and others who abolished slavery, most of it after World War II. And as Bernard Lewis, an expert most of his life, a retired professor at Princeton, has written copiously about Islam, and most of the time rather favorably said, the Muslim nations outlawed slavery recently largely due to the pressure of Western countries.
Right.
So there's an interesting sidelight here, for example, that slavery, and in the Quran, slavery is in no ways condemned.
Sure, sure. How has Christianity influenced literature, art, music, etc.?
Yeah, immensely so. In literature and art, for example, I cite a number of works just to be selective. How Christianity changed. You can go back in the early years with St. Augustine, who wrote The City of God, which was a defense of Christianity and showing that Christianity was not to blame for what the Romans often blamed Christianity for. And then you have, even before St. Augustine, Augustine died in 430, you have, for example, Tertullian, a layman, a lawyer from northern Africa who wrote copiously about many things about the Christian church. And we also have, for instance, even after St. Augustine's time, moving closer to our time, literature that was written in the English-speaking world. Elsewhere, for example, we have Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, a very interesting metaphor in terms of people living Christian. You have, for example, the book by Thomas More called Utopia, a book that is often misunderstood when we read about it in the history books. Utopia, More was a very brilliant individual. And by the way, he was persecuted by some people for his having written what he wrote. Right. But when he wrote Utopia, we often tend to think that he was advocating a world of perfection, a heavenly world, which we often see as a utopia. But that's not what he was saying. The word utopia in Greek comes from two words, uk, which means no or nothing, and topos, which means place. We get the word topography from topos. The Greeks were really saying, when they used the word utopia, there is no such place that is a perfect world. Right. And so More in his book was basically pointing out, basically he was, you might say with tongue-in-cheek, criticizing people's thinking, whether they were socialists or communists, that there could be a perfect world brought about by various political system. He was really, by using the word utopia, saying, there is no such place. So it's the great piece of literature. It's still being discussed a great deal. It's very cleverly written to bring out this kind of message. And you have then more recently, C.S. Lewis, right, the great defender of Christianity, who wrote many books, The Great Divorce, for example. And perhaps the best book I would recommend is his book, Mere Christianity, where he points out, again, the Christian influence. And he brings up a very important point. You know, we have a lot of people today.
What about music? Like in Islam, we have music is forbidden. And what Christianity contributed to music?
Christianity, as I cite a number of scholars saying, was born in the context of music, and rightly so. When we look, for example, on Maundy Thursday evening, just before Christ went to the Garden of Gethsemane, it says they went there singing psalms. Christians were singing from the beginning on, and we see that particular pattern that existed even after the time of Christ. And Paul advocates for people to be singing in psalms with one another. Right. And so later on, Christians began to write hymns. And to this day, Christian music is very often uplifting and inspiring. You have many great hymns, you know, many today, more recent hymn, you know, How Great Thou Art, or the other one, I'm thinking, blocking the name, the one with grace.
Okay, Amazing Grace.
Amazing Grace. Pardon my momentary slip of mind here. And then you have, for example, a song that we often sing, at least at Thanksgiving time. Only 3 stanzas. Now thank we all our God. I want to say a little bit of background about that hymn. It was written by a person by the name of Martin Rinkwert, a Lutheran pastor in the little town of Eilenburg in Germany. in the middle of the 30 Years' War, in the 1630s, a plague hit as a result of famine and people dying as a result of the war that was fought there. He buried as many as 40 to 50 people a day, being the only Lutheran pastor in the town. One of them was his wife. It's in this context he sat down and wrote, "Now thank we all our God." Can you imagine that happening today? We would probably right now curse we all our God.
Right.
You see the influence and the beauty of the Christian music. Or you take Isaac Watts in England. He wrote over 700 Christian hymns. Most of them we can't put, well, if we had all of his hymns, we'd have nothing else but his in the hymnal. But many of them, you know, our God, our help in ages past.
Well, what about the classical music like Beethoven and...
Yeah, well, likewise, another great Christian contributor music is Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. Even Einstein, who was not a Christian, said this was the greatest musician that the world has ever known. And he basically wrote, in fact, every piece of music he wrote, he would always put down in Latin, Sola Dei Gloria, all glory to God alone. Or De Jesu, in the name of Jesus, he would write. And you had, for example, likewise with Mozart, who on his deathbed basically, in part, contributed to the Requiem, and he wrote many hymns that were Christianly, with a Christian message. Likewise with Beethoven. And you can, or then we move to Handel with his great classic work of the Messiah. Right. Particularly when you hear the Hallelujah chorus. This man, and living in London, although he was born and raised in Germany, a contemporary of Bach. In fact, they were both born the same year, and both of them were Lutherans. And he went into England, to London, spent most of his life there. When he wrote the Messiah, for days, I think it was about 20 days he wrote it, he hardly ever ate any food. They would bring it to him, he was entranced. And when he wrote this particular hymn, why? Because he was taken in by the Christian gospel message. And it's probably one of the greatest pieces of music, if one wants to cite one example alone, is the Messiah. And how it's biblically based, for example, in terms of pulling passages from the Old Testament into his whole oratio, for example, of the Messiah.
في الظلام هو المصباح، وفي الجوع هو الغذاء، وللروح العطشة هو ماء الحياة. فيه كامل الإعلان عن محبة الله للإنسان. إنه الكتاب المقدس، كلمة الحياة التي تحتاجها كل نفس بشرية. يمكنك اليوم، إضافة إلى حصولك على نسخة من الكتاب المقدس، أن تستمع إليه أو تقرأه إلكترونياً باتباع الخطوات التالية. أولاً، ابعث بإيميل إلى العنوان التالي bible@hayatv.tv ونحن نرسل لك التفاصيل والروابط. أو يمكنك زيارة الموقع الإلكتروني التالي bible.is. في هذا الموقع يمكنك تصفح الكتاب المقدس أو الاستماع إليه، كما يمكنك تحميله على هاتفك الخلوي.
مشاهدينا الكرام، مرحبا بكم مرة أخرى. أتمنى أن يكون الجزء الأول قد نال إعجابكم. الآن يأتي دور الجزء الثاني، وهو عن الإسلام في الغرب. الدكتور ألفين شميت بصفته عالم اجتماع، فهو مهتم ومطلع جدا على الدراسات المتعلقة بالأقليات الدينية وتتبع الإحصائيات في الغرب، كما أنه مدرك جدا لمدى تأثير الدين على المجتمعات. سنرافقه في رحلة أخرى من الأسئلة حول ما يحصل الآن في أوروبا وأمريكا، وبالأخص حلم الأسلمة ومحاولات التأثير على الدول الغربية لتغيير هويتها لتصبح إسلامية. سنطرح كما في الجزء الأول أسئلة عديدة نسعى للحصول على إجابات عليها. ما هي نسبة عدد المسلمين في بعض الدول الأوروبية وفي أمريكا؟ كيف تخترق المنظمات الإسلامية المجتمعات الغربية خصوصا في أوروبا وأمريكا؟ هل يعرف الغربيون ماهية الإسلام؟ أم أن الإسلاميين بالأخص يستغلون الحرية الموجودة في الغرب استغلالا سيئا ليخدموا أجنداتهم. ماذا عندما يقول رؤساء الدول وبعض الشخصيات المهمة أن الإسلام دين سلام؟ هل يعنون ما يقولون أم أنهم يتحدثون بلباقة سياسية تجنبهم الإحراج مع أصدقائهم في دول إسلامية أخرى؟ هل يستغل الإسلاميون مسألة التمييز العرقي التي طبعت تاريخ أمريكا لصالح الإسلام؟ هل يستخدمون التقاليد الشرقية لاستدراج النساء الغربيات في الزواج بغرض الأسلمة؟ لماذا يبيعون صورة إسلام لايت في الغرب ويحتفظون بالصورة الحقيقية للإسلام في الشرق؟ هل هناك توعية كافية بماهية الإسلام في الغرب ليعرف الناس ما هو الإسلام الحقيقي ومن الذي عليه أن يقوم بهذا الدور؟ لدي الكثير من الأسئلة للدكتور شميت، ما عليكم إلا متابعة الحوار لآخره. Welcome again, Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We are going to talk about Islam in the West. My first question is, can you tell us how Islam is growing in Europe and the United States?
Yes, in recent years, and particularly since Second World War, which ended in 1945, Islam has been making a greater presence in Europe each and every year. And it's interesting how a lot of this happened. After World War II, Germany, for example, had a shortage of manpower. And so they imported Turks, obviously Muslims from Turkey.
Right.
Thinking they would work for a while and then go back home. Well, they didn't go back home. They brought their friends and relatives over. Similar thing happened in France. They brought Muslims from Algeria and some other African countries, and they too didn't go home. In fact, they brought more. And so the population, and England in a somewhat similar fashion, imported a lot of them, if I may use that word, from Pakistan and other places in the Near East. And so the Muslims began to migrate to the European countries, France, Germany, Italy, England, Belgium, Spain, right, Sweden, Denmark, you name it. And in addition to that, the non-Muslim population in Europe is not reproducing itself. The birth rate in France and Germany and England basically is about 1.41 per family. You need 2.2 just to stay even. The Muslim birth rate is 3-4 times of what the birth rate is of the non-Muslims. So it's not just migration that they're growing by, but also by a higher birth rate. And then there is a third factor, the fact of political correctness now in Europe, which makes it difficult for them to begin to restrict and restrain Muslims who, for example, in France, they're passing law where the girls may wear head coverings in school and other kind of things. And so political correctness is making it very difficult for them to assert traditional European values that are being challenged, in many ways ridiculed by the Muslim people. There is a lot of movement in England, for example, that people in certain areas want to have Sharia law established.
And it already happened.
And already happened in some areas.
Yeah.
And just recently, we're still a couple of days into Ramadan, the mayor of London advocated, encouraged the non-Muslims to fast during the Ramadan. Now you see how they're caving in to Islam, if you will, again as a result of political correctness and a lack of conviction relative to Christianity being also thereby attacked. Because as we know from history, Muslims only play the peaceful game when they're in a minority.
Right.
Once they have control of a value, there is no more freedom of religion. Or they try to capitalize on the Western value of freedom of religion, but only until they will have the power. They never tell us that, but look at history. All the way back from the Ottoman Turks, we see, for example, where they existed, there was no freedom of religion.
Right. And what about the United States? We talked a little bit about Europe. What about the United States?
United States, too. We see some figures, for example, very often exaggerated, inflated relative to the number of Muslims in this country. I've done a lot of research on this. And I see our census that we take every 10 years does not ask the question of a person's religious background. So the census is of no help. But we've had independent surveys at different universities, for example, in the State University of New York and other places, or the National Opinion Center at the University of Chicago, that it's taken samples. And they show, for example, that the Muslim population, or Zogby, by the way, is an Arab, he's not a Muslim, does a lot of polling, as you probably know, particularly in the political context, has shown there are no more than 3.5 million Muslims in the United States.
Right.
The media often talks about 7 to 12 million. That is absolutely false. It cannot be supported.
Especially CARE, for example.
Yeah, CARE, for example. Yeah, CAIR, as we often know, the Council of American Islamic Relations,
right,
which is a very pro-Muslim group. Unfortunately, the media often go to them for information, and they, of course, are promoting Islam in a rather subtle way, but they're by no means pro-Westernly oriented. And I might mention on the population figure of 3.5 million Muslims, 30 to 40% of those are black American Muslims, many of them of the Farrakhan type, which are not recognized by Islam. So you have, at best, 1% of the American population that consists of Muslims.
What are the implications of this growth, both in the United States and Europe?
Yeah, well, you see, it's interesting. When you try to, when the figures are exaggerated, it obviously impresses people. When you say 7 to 12 million, well, this must really be great. In other words, the old argument comes to mind that 40,000 Frenchmen can't be wrong. Likewise, that many Muslims can't be wrong, so we should accept them. That's the message that CARE and others are trying to promote, right, by exaggerating figures. But it's also interesting, there's a lot of misunderstanding. For example, we all know about the concentration of Muslims in Dearborn, Michigan, the most populous place of Muslims in the United States. But it's interesting, there was a survey done by the University of Michigan only a few years ago that showed even in Dearborn, 58% of the Arabs in Dearborn are
58%
Christian. They're not all Muslims. But the media
from other faiths.
Right. Media give the impression that if you're an Arab, you're a Muslim. No, no. The Zogbys did a study that showed in the United States, 76% of all Arab descendants in the United States are Christian. How do we explain it? Well, many of these people came from Lebanon and Syria already Egypt, in the late 1800s.
Right.
They were not Muslims. But the media does not give us that distinction. So when they talk about Dearborn, they make it sound like it's a place of 100% Muslim. Simply not true. Even in Dearborn, the Muslims are not a majority.
And how are Muslims and Islamic organizations infiltrating American and European society?
Well, they're influencing it by, for example, not being challenged when CARE or other proponents of Islam make statements about, and even, unfortunately, our President George W. Bush said Islam is a religion of peace. Whenever some political leader, and he was not the only one,
right,
Colin Powell said that, Tony Blair in England said that,
right,
Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State under Clinton, has said that. I cite them all in this particular book. And I asked the question, have these people ever read the Quran? Clearly, if they have, they're lying. My guess is they have not read. For example, the Quran has over 100 violent sword passages. They're not an example of a religion of peace. Let me just, for example, cite a couple that the public never hears. For example, in Surah 8, the 12th verse, I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Right. Therefore, strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them. End of quote. Another phrase, go when the sacred months have passed and slay the idolaters wherever you find them and take them captives and besiege them and lie in wait for them in every ambush. Another one out of Surah 9 says, O you who believe, talking about Muslims, Fight those of the unbelievers, you and me, who are near you, and let them find in you hardness of heart, and know that Allah is with those who guard against evil. One more passage. Fight them. Allah will punish them by your hands and bring them to disgrace, and assist you against them, and heal the hearts of the believing people. These passages, there are hundreds of in the Quran. So how can you say Islam is a religion of peace? I say they clearly have not read the Quran.
So you think that ignorance plays a big role here?
Ignorance plays a tremendous role because, you know, we're not only ignorant about Islam, we're also ignorant about Christianity, and that's, I think, the only valid explanation.
And what are the strategies Muslims are using in Europe or United States?
Well, one of the strategies they're using, they're trying to capitalize to their advantage our principles of freedom. For example, of freedom of expression. And they're trying to capitalize on the political correctness, so that if we say something that doesn't, what they don't like, immediately they will scream discrimination, and we back off. The media, for example, will simply not tell you. I have never heard any of these passages on the media, and I never will. And if I hold my breath, I won't live long because it won't be mentioned. And so the people do not get the truth. They get propaganda that is largely filtered through Muslim acceptance or CARES group that will not, for example, be upset if we say something negative about it.
Why the media says everything that they want about Christianity, for example, and they don't say the same thing about Islam?
You're quite right. There is a double standard, a highly double standard. You know, we have, for example, I document in the book that in California and some other schools, public schools, children are asked to dress up as Muslims. Can you imagine if they were asked to dress up as Christians to wear a cross? The American Civil Liberties Union will go crazy.
Right.
But when it's the Muslims, it's fine. There is, I believe, a either intended or unintended desire to destroy Christianity. And this is one way of doing it, to bring in Islam or Muslim philosophy and religion because it'll counter Christianity. There is a hatred, for example, of Christianity, in spite of the fact, as I mentioned, I think, during the break, many of these people who hate Christianity are living off of Christian capital, the benefits of Christianity, and they aren't aware of it.
Right. What are the weaknesses in the Western society that Muslims are trying to take advantage of?
Well, one of the weaknesses is, for example, our sexual immorality. When you turn on television, MTV, for example, good grief. And if they see United States through that particular prism, they see nothing but immorality.
Right.
And they take advantage of this. Say, oh, this is the whole West. This is what Christianity has done, as we addressed earlier on the other topic. Of course, it's not true. So they take advantage of our loose liberty. For example, also the aspect of same-sex marriages, which they criticize, and rightly so. But again, it is something that Christianity has never advocated and never approved, but the people don't know it, and so they take advantage of major weaknesses and major things that they see in the media today to their advantage to promote themselves. We are more morally oriented than you are as the United States or England or wherever else it might be.
You mentioned earlier like a high percentage of black Americans or African Americans being Muslims. Does it have anything to do with playing on racism card or something like that by Muslims?
To some degree, I believe it's a form of rebellion. You know, when people have something that they've never really understood and enjoyed, it's like a child sometimes in a family who's been treated extremely well will all at once rebel. And that's one explanation, I think, why a lot of black people, Americans, although the number is not nearly as great as it is often made, that go over to Islam. We had Cassius Clay, the fighter, years gone by, who became a Muslim. And then we've had other people, for example, with the whole Malcolm X, for example, to go back a few more years. And I think it's a form of rejection, a form of rebellion, really.
Does it have to do with relating Christianity to the whites, like the white persecuted, like something to do with history or something like that?
Well, there probably is, because if you go back to the founding group of the Nation of Islam, the founder, Fard, for example, argued that white people were created by a black scientist who made a mistake in the laboratory. Mm-hmm. So there you have a big, strong racist statement. Right. And so how many others are of like mind in the black society, among black people? I don't know. But I don't think we can say that racism is not a part of it. And they also perhaps see certain things in our society that they tend to blame on the white people, and therefore if I go to Islam, I will perhaps somehow not be part of that evil that we have in our day and age.
I heard also like big numbers of women converting to Islam. This is what I heard in media and by researching on internet and all that. Is that true? And what are the reasons of it?
The number of women converting to Islam, I have never seen any statistics on it. I'm not sure there are any. My guess is, having studied Islam in the United States and the Western world a lot, that the number is not very high, not very great. You find one or two people, and then those people are selected and given media exposure, from which people draw the conclusion, well, there are many others like them. I would like to see the evidence. Being a professor all my life, I like to see the evidence before I make a claim. And I haven't seen it in this case. My guess is, as I said, I don't think it's very high. Another question. Why do we find two different versions of Islam when we compare Islam as we know it in the Middle East and Islam preached in the West, either in Europe or the United States? Yeah, well, I would first ask whether there really are two different versions, or one that is presented so that the West would be more accepting of Islam. If they were to accept the Islam as it is found in, for example, Saudi Arabia, the most pure, if you will, right, or even, for example, in other parts, like in Iran with the Shiites, Americans would be, or the Westerners, would be turned off more by Islam than if they present, for example, the old cliche, Islam is a religion of peace, right, or when they say, for example, out of second surah, there is no discrimination among religion. Well, what our media don't tell the people, that the Quran, as you and I know, has a lot of passages that are no longer valid. They've been abrogated. Right. Let me briefly explain. Abrogated passages are those when a passage in the Quran contradicts or is in conflict with another passage. The more recent passage overrules the early passage. So all the violent passages are recent passages. The peaceful passages, or the passage about no discrimination on religion, is before Muhammad went to Medina. Right. And when we came to Medina, he began to use the sword to spread Islam. When he was in Mecca, before he went there, he tried to get people by peaceful persuasion, and that didn't work. Right. So finally, he with 60, 70 people escaped to Medina. And now all those early passages that contradict the later ones in Medina are no longer valid. They're abrogated. And the Quran talks about that itself. But our public never hears about abrogated passages. They hear the passage, there's no discrimination in religion. And then, by the way, people like CARE promote those passages, and the people think that's the whole story or the true story, but it is not. Why the media is trying to convince us that terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, and we see, for example, the 9/11 attacks were carried by Muslims? I think the media are afraid of being accused by CARE, the Muslim Society of America, and other like-minded groups of being discriminatory against them, and so they back off. And because they want to be politically correct, there's another motivation for them not to say anything critical about them. And so the word, even the present administration under Obama, won't even mention the word terrorist. Well, what are they? You know, they're obviously terrorists, what happened at 9/11 and other times. And they also don't want to give the impression that terrorism has anything to do with Islam. Well, as I said, they ought to read the Quran and some of the passages that I mentioned a little while ago, plus 100 others. And then they wouldn't be able to speak that way. But they don't.
I'm sure you're aware of their argument. Those people who carried the attacks are like extremists and who misunderstood some verses in the Quran. And this is largely used by Muslims to defend
I know they do.
Islam.
You're quite right. I talk in here, you see, I do not accept the term radical Muslim. What's a radical Muslim? It's not just a guy who blows up. What about the so-called radical Muslims, people who engage in terror? Did they believe the Quran? Yes, right down the line. Those who are perhaps not radical Muslims, you might ask the question, are they really Muslims or only Muslims in name? Like we have a lot of Christians who are only Christians in name. They're not Christians. Muslims in name aren't Muslims either. So the radical Muslim, and why are radical Muslims radical? Because the Quran is a radical book, and they're following it right down the line. But we don't hear that on the media.
No.
These are not exceptions. Also, we are told that they're only a small number. Well, some of the estimates have shown there are at least 150 million of so-called radical Muslims in the world. That's not a minority or a small number. But again, we don't hear that kind of news.
Half population of the United
Right,
States.
half the population of the United States. And that's been well documented. And that number is conservative. It's probably larger than that.
What should the public know about Islam, in your opinion? And how you think we can create some awareness among Europeans and Americans?
Yes, I get that question quite a bit when I speak. And one of the things that I tell people, read the Quran. But people don't. They don't read the Bible. They're going to read the Quran. We have to be kidding ourselves. But I still mention, and let me say why.
It's a difficult book. How they can read it?
You're quite right. And even the Muslim experts say 20% of the Quran cannot be understood.
Right.
But say all those violent passages, some of which I read a little while ago, are very clear. Those you can understand. It's a difficult book. In fact, I sometimes say it's like a verbal collage. You know what collage is an art. It's sort of like words thrown against the wall almost. It is not very coherent. And there's no chronology often in it.
Well, let me mention something else here, because you are advising people to read the Quran.
Yes.
But so many translations, if I don't say all of them, are misleading people. They don't translate the accurate translation. I read some verses, for example, in Arabic. My first language is Arabic. When I read the verse and I read the English version, I'm surprised. It's cheating, it's deceiving people, it's not telling the truth. Like the verses on Surah 4 about women. Beating women, I read it in different translations in English, gently or lightly.
Or not at all.
So how can you advise them to read since...
Yeah, let me say why. I think they're better off if they read the Quran closely than if they aren't. Let me give you an example. Back in 1300, a Dominican monk by the name of Recalde de Croce, who lived most of his life in the Middle East, wrote a book against Islam. 200 years later, in 1530, Martin Luther read this book. It was written in Latin about Islam. And Luther believed Islam could not be that bad as described by Recalde. 12 years later, he read a Latin copy of the Quran. Then he went back and wrote a defense of the book that he thought was too critical of Islam. You see what happened? After he read the Quran in 1543, he wrote a defense. 1542, he read the Quran first of all. He believed that if the Quran, and he asked it to be published, he believed that if people would read it, they wouldn't have anything to do with Islam. So that's why I'm arguing that if they read the Quran and looked at it closely and saw those violent passages, for example, 434 that you mentioned a little while ago, where it speaks about husbands should beat his wives, by the way, plural, not wife, it's plural, right. Beat his wife if she doesn't behave him. Now, some translations, as you mentioned, say beat her gently, which is kind of an oxymoron. Right. Or some translations don't even mention the beating at all. You and I just looked at one of new translation that you had in your office. It doesn't even mention the beating. All of this is, again, designed to trick the American, the Europeans, into accepting Islam, that Islam is really as good of a religion and maybe even better than Christianity. That's the method behind their operation.
Right. What should the role of the church be in this awareness process?
The church needs to educate its people. I get around to many parts of the country. I speak to Christian groups of one kind or another. I'm a Lutheran, but I often speak to non-Lutheran groups and whatnot. And one of the things that strikes me are Christians that are becoming increasingly ignorant. They do not know basic things out of the Bible. So we need to begin to teach them rather than to bring them in with entertainment like music and they don't understand. I taught at this college that called itself Christian, Illinois College, for example. And I asked students, most of them cannot give you 4 Gospels of the New Testament. Ask the average Christian whether he can tell you the 10 Commandments. He knows 2 or 3, which he sort of picked up by moving in society. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and maybe another one, no, you shall honor your father and mother. But what about the other 7? They don't have a clue. Why? Because we do not teach our people the basics as you would in baseball. You got to teach the fundamentals, the basics. It's not being done. And so we today, Barna Research Group out of California, which does a lot of survey across the country on religion, 2/3 of evangelical Christians, not the liberals, 2/3 no longer believe that Jesus Christ is the only way of salvation. In spite of the fact that Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me, John 14:6. Or where Peter said, for example, in Pentecost, neither is there salvation in any other, for there's no other name given under heaven among men whereby we can be saved, is no longer known or believed by so many Christians. So they hear in the media that all religions are either equally bad or equally good, probably equally good, and so they don't see any difference between Islam and what have you.
Well, this leads me to another question. What can you tell people who say we worship the same God and we should live in harmony, we should not criticize Islam, and if you criticize Islam, you are just promoting hatred toward Muslims. So how can you reply to that?
Well, again, that's a very good question, and it's a question that is very easily answered. Muslims and Christians do not worship the same God. They never have. Let me explain why. Christians worship Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity. Muslims despise the Trinity. The Quran condemns the Trinity. Christians, for example, argue that Jesus Christ was crucified. The Quran says, no, he was not. The Quran denies the crucifixion. That's another reason I'd like to have Christians read the Quran and see this. Hey, the Quran denies the crucifixion. Now, if you deny the crucifixion, you deny the resurrection. And if you take the crucifixion and the resurrection out of Christianity, what have you got left? Nothing but hot air. It's done for. But you see, this cliche, we all worship the same God, is absolutely false. No, we do not. We never have. And if you're a Christian, you never can.
And some Muslims are trying to sell the idea that they believe in Jesus Christ. They say all the time, we believe in Jesus Christ. We honor him. We have a chapter named after his mother. And some Christians bought that.
Yes, you hear quite often, we also honor Jesus Christ as a prophet. However, Jesus was more than a prophet, and you don't honor him when you deny that he was crucified and that he, as a result of his crucifixion, on the 3rd day rose from the dead. To say you honor him is also to be questioned in another score. The last great prophet, even more so than Jesus, was Muhammad.
Right.
Now, that's not honoring Jesus when you place him on a lower level than you do Muhammad. And so the remarks, and again, because of ignorance, the Muslims or the pro-Muslim promoters get away with this. They are simply speaking to an ignorant Christian group, and I can often, if I may use the phrase, pull the wool over their eyes.
Thank you again, Dr. Schmidt. It was a privilege having you here.
Well, thank you for having me. My joy and pleasure.
مشاهدينا الأعزاء، أتينا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة. أتمنى أن تكونوا قد استفدتم من هذا الحوار مع الدكتور ألفين شميت. أطلب من أي شخص لديه تعليق أو ملاحظة أو سؤال أن يبعثه لنا على الإيميل حتى نستفيد منه في إعداد حلقات قادمة. لكم مني ومن طاقم البرنامج أطيب التحيات والمتمنيات، وإلى اللقاء في حلقة أخرى بعون الله.